So we've talked a little bit about the process for taking our experiment where we've built and trained a machine learning model and publishing that as something that we can use as a web service. And the first step in that is to create a predictive experiment. So let's take a look at that. So here's my experiment for creating a classification model where I've got patients that I've got various bits of information from, and I'm predicting whether or not they are likely to have diabetes. So I've built that model, I've tested it, I've evaluated it. I'm pretty happy that it's ready for me to use. So I'm ready to go and create a web service from this. And the first thing I do is I take this experiment, which is my training experiment, where I've trained the model, and I've run it. So you can see that the text, I've already run it. And having run it, I'm now ready to go and create a predictive web service. And when I do that, what actually happens is we get a predictive experiment. So you can see here, creating predictive experiment, and you'll see some things moving around on the screen, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And off it goes, and it creates that predictive experiment. So I've now got my original training experiment. I can see that tab up here. There's my training experiment for Pima Big Data. And I've now got what looks initially like a copy of that experiment called Predictive Experiment. Now, it's given it a new name. It's actually a completely separate experiment. So it's given it a new name, and you can see it's Pima Big Data and then Predictive Experiment, which isn't very friendly. So I'm going to just change that to Diabetes Predictor so that we know what this one's about. Now let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at some of these changes that have been made. And the first thing I can see is these little blue modules have been added. So I can see there's a web service input that's been added here that connects to the same place as my original training data. If you remember, the training data is what I brought in from Azure Blob Storage. It's the patient feature data that I brought in. And that's what we used ultimately to train the model. But you can see that there's an extra connection here for a web service. Now, at the moment, we're looking at this as an experiment which I can run in the environment, so it would still use that training data, but I can toggle between that, and I can see, in this case, the data would come from the web service input. And that means that web service input, whenever I call this web service, it's going to have the same schema as the original data that I brought in from my Azure storage. And if you remember, that was a comma-separated file, or a set of comma-separated files. It didn't have any column names, and it included all of the features, and it also included the label. It included that diabetic label, that classification label. So it's created a web service input for that. We'll come back to that in a minute. Let's just look and see what else has been done. I can see as I go through here that there's some cases where it's got the same modules that I've got in the original experiment. So we've got an edit metadata, we've got apply math operation, all that's fine. But then there are cases where it's done things like this. It's got an apply transformation, and that's connected in this case to a normalized data. And then the same thing here, if I just scroll down and rearrange that a little bit, we've got another apply transformation and a normalized data. And then we've got the actual trained model, which we then scored to get our output. So what's actually going on here is, in the original training experiment, we had a couple of cases where we normalized the data. So we had a whole set of training data, and some of the columns we normalized using a z-score, and some of them we normalized using a min-max. But either way, we normalized the data so that they, instead of having their true values in their true scale, we normalized them so they were all in a scale between 0 and 1. And that put all the data on the same scale and made it easier to work with. Well, the thing about that is, of course, the values you get within that scale depends on the statistics of the training data that you're working with. And that's fine when we're just working with a static set of training data, but when we deploy this as a web service, we might get data in that's maybe just a single row. So if it's a single row, we can't really scale it between 1 and 0 based on the statistics of the data set. And I might get a batch of data coming in, but it might not exactly match the statistics that we trained with. So we need to apply the same kind of algorithm to generate these values between 1 and 0 that we did when we scaled the training data, but we need to do that without having to rescale it and recalculate those statistics. So we've encapsulated the statistics of the training data in here, and we just apply that transformation to whatever data gets sent into the web service. Same thing with the next one. And then we're obviously not training a model in the web service. We've already trained it. So we take our trained model and then we just simply apply that to the new data that's coming in. So these bits down at the bottom of my experiment here are different from the modules that I've got in my training experiment. So there's a couple of things I want to do. As I go through the end of that, I then score the model, and the scored output is what gets sent to the web service output. So we've got a web service input, which is the features I want to predict from, and a web service output, which is the labels I've predicted. So I want to make some changes to this. First of all, I don't really want to include the diabetic label in the input. It's reasonable that if a client application is calling my web service, it's trying to predict whether or not someone is diabetic. So it seems a bit strange to actually pass in a value of true or false for diabetic. So we don't want to include that in the input. And I also don't want to have the column names in my input schema just be call 1, call 2, call 3, just what we've got when we brought in our data from our Azure storage. I actually want to give those inputs fields some names so that when we pass parameters to our web service, we know what the parameters are that we're passing. So to do that, I'm actually going to get rid of this import data and also the edit metadata, which specifies the names of the columns. Don't need those. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in an alternative data source that defines my input schema for the web service. And there's a number of ways I could do this. I could use any sort of data set or any sort of import to do this. I'm actually just going to enter the data manually. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter it as CSV data, and I'm going to include the header. So we'll just actually go and put some values in here. And what I'm doing is saying, look, the input for this is a patient ID, the number of pregnancies, the plasma glucose, and so on and so on. But it doesn't include the diabetic label because that's not really an input. That's what we're trying to predict. And here's some values to give you an idea of what types of data we're expecting in those fields. So that then is going to be my input, and I now no longer need the edit metadata to change the column names because the column names are here. So I can connect that directly to the join data and join it to my physician's data here. And that's also going to be what I use for my web service input. So that gets connected to the same place, and that means that my web service will use the same input schema that's defined here rather than the original training input. So having done that, that means I've removed the diabetic column, the label that was in the training data. So if there's any modules in here that have been copied across that actually work with that, I need to edit those and remove any references to it. And in my edit metadata here, I actually used that. I cleared that as a feature. So I'm just going to open that up and say, well, we're not going to have the diabetic label anymore. So we'll get rid of that. And we're not going to reference that. And I haven't referenced it in anymore. I happen to know that. But I would go through and just make sure I haven't referenced it anywhere else. These things are actually encapsulated from the logic that was determined when we did the training. So that's all ready for me to go. And then I just score the model at the end. So I'm going to actually run this and see what happens. We'll just run that data through the pipes. And it's going to run using that manual data that I just entered. So I entered some manual data there. And that's going to go and run that experiment. And when the experiment is finished, it seems to have run successfully using that new input data that I gave it. And I can look at the output here from my scored model. And I can see that I've got that one row of test data that I put in there, and it's gone and done all the things it needs to do to get the physician and calculate the scored labels and the scored probability that are going to be the output from this web service. So, well, that's fine, but you can see that this output includes all of the columns, the patient ID, the pregnancies, the plasma, and a lot of these were passed in as inputs. So I probably don't want to necessarily pass them all out from my web service. I probably want the patient ID just so I can guarantee which patient we're talking about, the physician, maybe the scored labels and the probabilities, but probably not the others. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a SQL module here, apply SQL transformation. And we'll connect the output of the scored model to that, and then the output of that to my web service output. And we'll go and modify this SQL expression here. So we'll just bring that out. And instead of just selecting all of the columns, I'm going to select the patient ID. And I'll also select the physician. And then I want the scored labels. And that's not really a very meaningful output for a client application. So we'll bring that out as diabetes prediction. And we'll bring out the scored probabilities. And again, that's not a very meaningful name, so we'll just bring that out as probability from T1. So that's what we're going to bring back as the output from our web service. We'll just tidy up the code a little bit there. And then we're ready to go and run that and just see what that looks like. And when that's finished running, I can take a look at my output from my apply SQL transformation here. And sure enough, I'm just getting the patient ID, the physician, the diabetes prediction, and the probability. So what I've done then is I've created a predictive experiment from my training experiment. And initially it copied some of the modules across, but I changed the input. I changed the data source because I wanted to have control over the input schema for my web service. So I got rid of the label column that I don't want to include, and I got rid of that in any other modules where it was used. And that now is my web service input. So when my clients call the web service, that's what they will have to provide as the input parameters. We then have all of the transformations that record the training data or record the statistics from the training data are encapsulated here, so they will work with new data. And then we change the output from our score model so that we just output from this web service the columns that we want to return to the client application.